Welcome to another .NET user group with a focus on Blazor from Sunny Bournemouth in Dorset, part of the .NET Foundation. Well, it's great that you've been able to join us yet again for another presentation around Azure, .NET and Blazor. So, what have we got in store for you today? Our guest speaker today is Jon Hilton, who will be talking about how to build a search engine with Blazor and Tailwind CSS. We'd also like to thank our community sponsor Syncfusion for their community license of their Blazor components and also their support for our group, enabling us to give away swag and other goodies. This video forms part 2 of a 2-part presentation where Jon will be demonstrating a Blazor search engine with Tailwind CSS. If you missed part 1, you can find it either in the links below or directly on the Assemblysoft YouTube channel. Well, we're certainly looking forward to this one. Let's dive right in. We do have a little prize draw as well, I think I mentioned earlier, for I believe it's an Amazon gift card, courtesy of Syncfusion for this community event. So stick around for that and be entered into the wheel. And if anyone does have any questions, we can certainly ask Jon to hang around and offer a Q&A at the end. But if any of you need to leave earlier, feel free to post anything and we can always forward those to Jon and get you some answers. And also just a quick thanks to a few of you who basically have been supporting us over the last couple of events. We've now gained membership into the .NET Foundation, which offers some benefits to all really in terms of a little bit of support, and over time we'll hopefully be able to deliver some really good content for you guys. So thanks for that. Incidentally, in terms of by way of a poll, using the reactions, how many in the meeting currently have actually started using or are using Blazor? Awesome, quite a few of us. Yeah, superb. Okay, lovely. Well, we'll hand back over to Jon, who looks keen and ready for our second presentation.
That's a pre-recorded video, that's why. Cool. There's a question there, by the way, in the chat about PWA support. I haven't used it in Anger, but I believe it's, it exists. And I've done a few PWAs with React. And when I looked at it, it looked, fairly comparable. I think PWA is a funny one because you can just tick the box and say it's now a PWA. And that is actually part of it. And then beyond that, obviously, there's all sorts of things about, caching and all those kind of things, offline and everything. But yeah, I believe the support exists and should be pretty good. So, okay, so switching up a bit now to actually building something kind of more meaningful using Blazor. So this is all Blazor WebAssembly still. And we're going to interact with the Marvel Web API, which you can go and sign up for if you so wish. But if you head over to the chat again, I'm just going to do a very similar thing to the thing that we did at the beginning of the last talk. So I'm going to show something else on the screen now. And again, just immediate reaction, what your feeling, emotion, or thought is when I move this slide along. So let's just do this. This is actually really quite good. It's like a useful little survey. So CSS is interesting. We've got in the chat, by the way, Chris loves it apparently. So if you need any CSS work doing, I think you've just found the man to go and speak to. People find it time consuming. Someone's linked to a GIF. I don't know whether it's safe for work or indeed home. I've got my own GIF, which I always quite like to dig out at these points. I used to work with a network infrastructure engineer who had this mug and enjoyed using it, I think. So CSS, so personally, I've always kind of struggled with it in as much as I find it time consuming, which I think someone put in the chat. And more specifically, I think I've sometimes found there's a disconnect between what I know I'm trying to do and being able to do it with CSS. And especially, as someone else, Mark's put in the chat there about it being bloated now, I think as well there's lots of choice now. So for example, do you use Flexbox, do you use CSS Grid, do you, all those kind of things come into it. I mean, I'm slightly old school with this because when I started, I just floated everything left and right and that was enough. But apparently you're not really supposed to do that anymore. So, although if nobody's looking, I think it's fine. But, so Tailwind, we're going to look into Tailwind CSS, and we kind of touched on it earlier, but Tailwind's really interesting. I don't think I've met anybody who didn't, when they first saw Tailwind, kind of stare at the syntax and have an emotional reaction to the fact, there's a lot of text, it's quite verbose, and is this not just inline styles? So it's one of those strange things that doesn't look good, I think. And I think they're aware of that, which is probably why on this homepage, they actually go to this effort of showing it you in action to try and convince you it's a good idea. But the gist of it is that you have these kind of utility classes, if you like, that you can employ to very quickly, as they're showing you in this little demo, iterate on your UI to make it look half decent, without having to define lots of your own classes, and essentially to also do things like making it responsive with some very simple CSS classes. And we were saying earlier, I was chatting to Carl about it, what's interesting is that once you start using it, I think that's when you start to appreciate where it has merit. And also it's quite predictable. So once you've tried once you've got your head around the basic syntax, you find yourself thinking, oh, I wonder if this is how to do that, and it usually turns out that it is. So I think it's good for that. Again, if you do want to grab the demo code, you are welcome to if you want to follow along. And what we're going to do is we're going to use Tailwind and Blazor WebAssembly to build a Marvel search engine. And essentially, I always like to start with a mock-up. So the general thing I found building for the web that works for me, and I know from speaking to people works for other people, is to start with some kind of design or mock-up or something that you can kind of get your teeth into and think, right, how am I going to build this? I did used to have a boss who used to love giving us designs in Excel, where he'd use the borders on the cells to draw his mock-up for us, which was always an interesting one to try and decipher. But this is a slight step up from an Excel mock-up. And when facing something like this, my first thought is, well, where are the components? How can I break this down? So if we look at it, you've got this kind of search area, so the search box, you've got search results. And the interesting thing, I think, when I do this exercise of trying to identify the components, is it also brings out the words that you need to use, and therefore actually the names of the components. And I tend to find it works better when they're domain specific. So I think we have a tendency as technical developers to sometimes name things in kind of technical ways. But this is also an opportunity to say, look, this is a search box, these are search results, and to kind of embed that language into what we build, which also bridges the gap between us and the client that we're building for. But we don't need to stop here. We can kind of keep doing this. It is literally components all the way down. So we can go from here and then dig in a bit further and say, well, look, within the search results, what have we got here? Well, these are results themselves. So we've got the kind of search results with an S panel, and then within that, individual results. And we can just keep going. So, within a result, we have artwork or image or icon or whatever you would call that, and the name, and just keep going down. And what this gives us is a kind of idea of the kind of components that we're going to build. And there's nothing else to do really but try and build it. So let's have a look. I'm going to dive into code again. I'm going to, so I've switched to a different project, and all I'm just going to do, as we did before, is .NET Watch run. As I say, you're welcome to grab the code. I'll just put the link back in the chat for anybody who wants to do that. Okay, so this is just building, and I think it'll be on the same port, probably. So if I just, it may not be, let's just check. No, I moved it. I find myself doing that, not least because spinning out lots of demo projects, they all try and hog the same ports, and then you get into problems. So there you go. So I'll explain that in a sec. I'm just going to get you the link from GitHub. Okay. Right, there you are. So yeah, so this is our project. Now, as you can see, unlike the new project template that we've all seen now and probably dream of in our sleep, the new Blazor counter, fetch data, and survey, and all those kind of things, I've kind of taken all that out. I did start with those, but then took them all out and just replaced it with this, which is essentially nothing at this point. And I also used Chris. So Chris Sainty's got an excellent blog post on adding Tailwind CSS to your Blazor app. So that is essentially what I followed to get us to this point. And I'm sure you can agree, it looks incredible actually already. So what this is doing though is actually quite important. So when you download this code, if you do, you won't see this. What you will see is not an error, but a kind of bit of advice. And that's because there is an app settings.json file in which is my Marvel API key, which for obvious reasons, I'm not going to go sharing too widely at this point, just because, you know, might get me in trouble with Marvel if everyone starts using it. But if I rename that to just something else, then what you'll find is when that recompiles, if it does, there you go. So what we have here is just a real simple instruction, if you do download the code, of how to get started, which is to head to app settings and just put your API key in there. Once you do that, that message will disappear. This is all very Blue Peter, this demo. So here is one I did earlier. And that now says, you know, we found your API key. In terms of what that looks like, by the way, if you're interested in the code for that, it's pretty straightforward, but it's this code here. So this is saying, look, what I'm going to do is use the Microsoft configuration to get hold of that file. So I'll show you in a minute where that's all configured. And then just basically say, look, if it's null or empty, show some interesting, helpful message. And otherwise just say the key is detected. Now, already we can see what Tailwind CSS does for us here. So if I say, I don't know, this message up here, I want it to be bigger text, so text XL, for example, and then refresh. Okay, that's now bigger text. And there's obviously under the hood, there's known sizes for these different things, which you can find on the website. But what you tend to find is actually you kind of play it by sight a bit. After a while, you start to get your head around what you want it to do. So for example, you know, things like font bold, if you want to do that, you can do text red. And these are all different shades. And again, on the website, they have these all visible, so you can actually see what you're getting. But already you can kind of see how it's that rapid iteration, I think, that you get with Tailwind that kind of makes the difference. So this is a good starting point. If you wanted to explore this project and see how this is all working, there's, again, Chris's blog post goes through this. So that would be the best place to go. But we've essentially got our own site.css here with, and I think I literally copied this from your post, Chris, some styles that basically just make sure that the errors show up properly when they appear in your app. And then essentially what happens is through this gulp file, that all gets compiled. So this brings in all the Tailwind classes and all the Tailwind styles, when you run that gulp file there, and what you get in the CSS folder in www root is this site.css. Now, when you look at this, you immediately think that's quite big, and it is. So it's several meg at this point. But what you can also do for production is run a utility that basically trims that down to just the styles that you're using. And when you do that, I've yet to see any app that has more than a few K, 3, 4, 5, 6K. It does get ridiculously small once you trim it down to the things that you're actually using in your app. So that's great, but for development, it's kind of handy to just have them all here. So it's easier to work with. So that's how it's all set up. And the one other thing just to signpost is in program.cs. So in Blazor, we now have program.cs, which is where we can configure the app. And what we have in here, and I might just, if I can work out how to do it. There you go. It might look a bit ugly, but just try and get a bit of wrapping so we can, there you go, just make it a bit smaller. So what we've got here then is essentially the absolute key here is that we've overridden the HTTP URI. So what this is the kind of default HTTP client that we get in our Blazor app. And usually that would point at your own API. I mean, that would be the intention of it being there. But in this case, and just for ease, I've overridden that because we haven't got any API of our own to point to the Marvel API. In practice, what you might do is actually create multiple HTTP clients essentially for different APIs. And you can use HTTP client factory to get hold of those. But for now, the kind of simplest way was just to override that. So without further ado, let us try and get ourselves going with this. So as I say, we're trying to build that mock-up that we saw. So if I just create a directory and call it features, this is something that I'm a big fan of, which is to use this idea of features and break the app down into smaller features and put them in here. But for now, we'll just create a simple search panel.razor or whatever we want to call it. Just bring up that over there. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and kind of build a very simple bit of markup now to render a search input. Now it's kind of what we did before. If we just do this, input type equals text and then maybe a button. So I'll just put a button in here and just put on, search and a heading. Marvel search engine. Now, from the get-go, this is going to look fairly boring. As we know from what we saw before, it's a component, so we'll need to render it. So I'll just render it in here for now under this config check. And one thing I'll have to do, so if I try and do this refresh, chances are we'll run into an error, or it just won't, actually it probably just won't show. And that's because it doesn't know where it is. And we could either bring a using in here, or we can do it in imports .razor there. And what we can do is just say using Marvel search demo dot and then features. And that now just saves us doing that on every single component as we go. So with that in place, if we refresh, okay, so we've got, and this is the thing with Tailwind, because it doesn't do anything for you. It can be a bit jarring when you first do anything and you say, well, that's, I mean, that's literally not styled at all, really. But immediately you get into using Tailwind to style this up. So you can do things like we did before, text to XL. And this is where I think the feedback loop that we currently have with Blazor does make this harder. And as I say, changes are coming, but it's just, this takes a bit longer because you're having to kind of wait for the recompile, hit refresh to get this to work. But we can do this and we can do things like the margin at the bottom. So MB is margin at the bottom, and we can say we're going to increase that. And as I say, just get this refresh, and very quickly you start to see it coming together. You can change things like centering the text. So if I put this in a div and do text center, and then wrap that like so. That will take care of centering everything on the page. We can do things like borders. So we do a border around the button there. Actually, probably rather do a border around the input because at the moment it's not very visible. So we do like a border and then just do, again, with these predefined colors. Obviously you can override this and create your own predefined colors like, you know, primary or secondary or whatever it is that you might want to do. Increase the padding. And what you get, you know, fairly quickly is that it starts to come together. So if I refresh this now, all right, you know, not beautiful yet, admittedly. But if I kind of just jump us forward a few steps, and this is where it's interesting, I'll take that out, we'll come back to that in a sec. But the crucial thing here, if we just, we'll wire that up in a minute. In terms of the styles, this is where it's kind of interesting because when you look at it, it does look verbose and you think, wow, that's quite a lot of text. But then when you use it, you're like, actually, this, you know, I can follow this and I can get my head around it. And it's very, very quick to change things. So if, for example, we decided that we really like rounded text boxes, for example, we could choose to do a medium rounded or a large rounded. And again, these are all kind of predefined. But immediately you see that. And then if you say, you know, you want a shadow, you can do that. So it very quickly comes together. And there's our basic kind of UX, UI for our Marvel search engine. So what I'm going to do is switch now to a different branch just to show how we can wire that search up. And we'll just wipe what I've done so far. Okay, let that recompile. Okay. So here's our search box as it now stands. And all we've done here, so it looks as we thought, all we've done though is wire up with two-way binding. So this is as we saw before, the search term, and then make the on-click so that when we search it, it says console.write and then searching. So we just check that that works. Okay, searching. So we are good. Now, the next logical thing to do from here would be to figure out how we're going to show results. And again, this is where Tailwind, in my recent experience, especially when I did that crazy project of rebuilding everything in lots of different frameworks, Tailwind made the CSS side of that a lot easier than it might otherwise have been. And it makes using things like Css Grid considerably easier as well. So what we'll do is we'll head over to the results page. So I'm just going to go here and just do search results.razor. And I'm a big fan when it kind of prototyping something like this of using hard-coded data to get something up and running and then quickly iterate from there. So what we can do is essentially just say, look, we just need some kind of list so that we can get something on the screen. And this could be anything actually. But if for now, I just create a class and just say search results, just create this as a property. You probably wouldn't keep it in here, but it is possible. And again, just to get, you know, a pragmatic something up and running, we can do that. And we can just do a string name, not what we do for now actually. And we can, you know, make sure we have one of those to start with. So what we now have is search results. Oh yeah, okay. So that's just an issue of, in Blazor, if you try and use the same name as the component name, you'll run into issues. So what we could do there is just call it results or something else, just to avoid that conflict. So now what I can do is for each over this list of results and do something for each one. So if I just put some in here so that we've got some data to work off, and then do 2 just because 1 probably doesn't prove that the list is iterating properly, but 2 hopefully does. Okay, so we have a list of search results, and now we just want to render them. And obviously I could just to quickly prove whether that works or not, do results dot name. And obviously we're not rendering this anywhere, so just check if we haven't already. Head over to index, and then we can just say search results and show that there. And because we added the namespace to the imports.razor, that will now pick that up automatically. And there it is. So again, we're not winning many prizes for design or UI at this point, but I always like to start there, because I think if I've got a list and I've iterated over the list and I'm rendering markup, that's kind of stage one. And from here, we can just iterate on this design. And what we want to do is kind of render cards for these. Now, this takes a bit of trial and error in reality. And it's interesting whether you have views on whether you use, Flexbox or CSS Grid or whatever it might be for this. But let's say that we choose to use CSS Grid. So what I would do is essentially just say, look, I want to use grid cols and then the number. So let's say we want to do 6 columns here. So that kind of takes care of that bit, first of all. You can put a gap in here. So you can do like gap 4 just to put a gap between them. And then if I change this to a div, okay. And then we'll just refresh to see what that's looking like. Okay, so it's not really doing much at this point. But if I now give this a border, we can begin to get our heads around what we're seeing. This is, again, what I would probably do, just make it visible. Padding 6, so you see some of the classes in play here, margin 2. So it's generally like padding 6 or padding top 6 or padding bottom 6, and then you can do things like padding on the x-axis or padding on the y-axis. And the reason it becomes predictable is because it's exactly the same for margin at that point. So you very quickly kind of get into that habit of just knowing what the style is that you're looking for. So if we just refresh this now, so we can see that we've got our cols here. If I just blow this out, okay. So if I put a max width on here, so that's obviously rendering rows at the moment. If I just put a max width in here, I think I've missed one class, which is grid. There you go. Okay, and if I refresh now, what you'll see, okay, so it's put it into the columns. It's kind of specified a max width. Now we've got something going on at the moment of it resizing there. And it could be that on smaller screens, we don't want 6 columns because that's quite a lot. And the way we can do that with Tailwind is we can actually use the responsive override. So we can say, for example, that we'd start with, I don't know, say 1. And then at certain breakpoints, we would up that to 2. So for small, and these again are all predefined. Maybe at the medium size, we would up that to 3, and so on and so forth. And then if I refresh this and we look at it, so what we should have now on really small screens is 1. And then as we go bigger, it will jump to 2. And then as we continue, it'll go to 3 and then 4 and so on and so forth. So that's pretty, it's pretty straightforward to put that in like that. And we're kind of halfway there now. We've got, it's probably being a bit optimistic to call this a card, but it's beginning to get close to looking like the kind of card thing that I had in mind to show search results. And like I say, you can do things like rounded at this point, and we could iterate on this. But we're kind of getting to the interesting point now, which is we've proven that the UI will work and we could spend time refining this if we wanted to. But how do we actually wire this up to the Marvel search, iterate over the results, make the search work? So let's do that. So if I'll just head over to here. So we've got an interesting thing where the search component is in one place and the search results are in another place. So what we kind of need to do at this point is communicate out from the search box when we actually put a search term in, so that we can then at the higher level grab the results and then render the results, push those results into our search results component. So it's tempting, perhaps, to do the Marvel search in here, but I'm kind of going on then a design decision here that the search box is done in the sense that you put a value in and it propagates the value out, and then something somewhere else decides what to do with that. And the way that we can do that in Blazor is to use something called an event callback. So if I just bring that in, so it's going to be a parameter. And what we're saying is we want a way from the outside, so from wherever we use this component, to give it some behavior that we want to be executed. Now this component, therefore, won't know what this is. We're essentially sending in a reference to a function here, but it doesn't know what that's going to be. But what we can do is call that at the right time. So we can say on search dot invoke async. And what we can do is actually pass in the string. So because I've said that this expects to take a string, we can pass in search term at this point. And that's it. So search is still relatively dumb. It just takes a text input and then kind of sends that, invokes this on search. But what do we want to do with on search? So in our index, well, that's kind of up to us. But what we want to do in this case is actually do the searching now. So we can do on search equals and then whatever it is that we want to do. And we just need, I'll do it in index. I mean, obviously we might move this, but if I create a handle search that takes in the search term. Okay, so we can now accept that here, like so. So that's good, but obviously we're not, how are we actually going to do this search at this point? Well, the Marvel API, the implementation of that is all done over HTTP and REST. So essentially we just want to make a HTTP call here. And we can do that by bringing in the HTTP client up here. So inject HTTP client, which if you remember, we configured in the program.cs earlier to point to the right URL. And all we want to do is make our GET request here. So I'll just copy this in so I get the correct syntax. Okay, so what this is let's have a thing. This is going to be, we're going to want to put this into a model of some sort. So we'll create that. We'll create that up here. Now I'm going to create an object for this because essentially what we want to do is deserialize the Marvel response into some kind of object. So I'll create that class here as well. So I'll do it down here for a second. Okay, and then we just want to bring in, I just need to bring in, that's why, so HTTP. Okay, so that's just worth knowing, by the way, is that when you inject anything, you can alias it. So HTTP client is the type, and then HTTP in this case is the name. But if I call that client, that's what it was expecting before. Okay, and then the URL. So the URL for our Marvel search is going to be this, which you'll see in a minute why I didn't want to type this all out in real time. But essentially what that's doing is just going to characters, name starts with, and then the search term that we're getting from our search box components. And then it's reading from configuration our Marvel API key. Now, in truth, you may well not want to put this into the component like this. You might want to put this into an API service or a class of some kind of description. But just for demo purposes, this works. So what we've then got is this handy thing here that says, well, I'm going to turn that result from that HTTP GET into one of these, which is this class that we just created. Now, building that class, I just did manually. And again, I'm going to copy this in for the simple reason that it's a bit verbose to type out. But the way the Marvel response comes back, essentially it's kind of wrapped in a wrapper, and then you get a list of results. So you've got this wrapper this overall object, and then inside that there's this data, and then inside that is results. And then you also get the all-important attribution text so that you can legally cover your back and say where this data came from. So that's it. So what we're going to end up with is our search response. And what we really want to do when we get that is pass it into our search results. So we can do that by just saying, you know, results equals search response. Obviously, search results at this point doesn't accept that parameter. So we can head over to search results, and we can kind of forget about this now actually, and our temporary class that we created. And we just do a parameter, and we can say prop, and it's going to be this type. And it's going to be, remember what I called it? I think it was results. Let's just check. Yep, results. And that's it. And now we can loop over our results. We can loop over the data.results. So there's a bit of a clunky naming going on there. But that will now give us, with a bit of luck, our search results and loop over them. So I'm going to test this now. Moment of truth. Unhandled error. So this is a good thing to watch out for actually. At the point that this component tries to render initially, this is going to be null because nothing's basically instantiated that. So we can do two things. We can either put an if check in here and say we're going to run over, we're going to check, sorry, this isn't null, or we can do it down here and we can just say equals new and new it up. So either of those would work. But what that should do is that, by the way, I don't. Okay, that's because, yeah, that's just because we put the Marvel search result in a funny place. Chances are you'd move that into its own class somewhere else. But with that safety valve in place so that we'll always have a new object to work from, when we refresh this now, what we should find, okay, head back, just put my if check in, if results. So we've got the, as I said before, Blazor's interesting way of showing errors, which is always worth digging into. Okay, so essentially that if check just says if results isn't null, then we're good to go. And if I now search for Spider-Man or indeed Spider or anything like that, then it comes back. So we've done the search, we've done our HTTP GET to the Marvel API, and then we've rendered for each of those results our result up here. And if we did, for example, that attribution text, just to show you how that would work, so we'd have results dot and then attribution text, and that would just make sure that we're, you know, all important legally compliant with Marvel, because we don't want their lawyers coming after us. It'll be the same problem actually, that needs to be inside the if, so I'll just move that into there. And then do a refresh and just say, do that again. There you go. So we're now legally compliant, which is always good news. And then just finally, just to show how this would work in terms of images, if we want to display, so the Marvel API returns images, and showing images is always a bit fiddly in terms of just like how they fit and how you can make them look half decent in a situation like this. So what we can do is we can access the URL here because we've got it in the response. So if we look at results dot thumbnail, so we've got hold of that. But what they also do is give you a result dot, I think it's the thumbnail object actually includes two parts, a path and an extension. So again, I'll just copy this in for time. But what we can do is essentially lump those two together. So here we can just, now this syntax is always funky, but what we've done here is we've essentially broken into C# again here. So this has gone from being a string. We've broken into C# so we can write C#. And then we're interpolating. So this is always interesting when you see it in the code, interpolating the thumbnail path and the thumbnail extension to show them up here. And what the crucial bit about this is this object contains. So Tailwind just makes it a bit easier to do this. But the different way of showing images is to try and constrain them to, for example, always keep the same ratio, but make them smaller, or let them grow bigger, or let them expand beyond the confines of where they are. And this one just means that it will always keep the ratio, so it'll look decent. But it will also keep it within the box, so you don't get a strange thing where it blows out past the box that you're trying to put it in. There you go. And that's it. So that's Marvel Search done in not too much code using Tailwind CSS and Blazor.
Brilliant, John. Thank you so much. I think everyone enjoyed that, and just how quick, really, that was, you know, to put that together in terms of the amount of CSS as well. It was all the class-based, wasn't it? And a lot of repeated code in terms of once you've mastered those initial classes, it was, you know, pretty much a repeat of those. We had one comment actually from a question or comment from Andrew Wilkin regarding the null checks, and you know, we find ourselves writing that code quite often, don't we, around the blocks. It's nice that you can render something else while your collection is null, but he was just saying that it's a bit of an irk, really, having to kind of put it everywhere. Have you got any thoughts on that, John?
It's an interesting one, because actually, I've got to admit, under the pressure of live coding there, I expected this to work where I knew that up, and I'm probably missing something obvious with the fog of typing all this code in live, because that's something I've tried as an alternative, basically. But I mean, you take the hit that you're newing objects up, you know, temporarily, if you like, so that they can get set later by something else. But I'm not aware of any way of avoiding the if. It definitely crops up everywhere, and it's in the official docs as well. Like when you look at their examples, that's the way they seem to recommend to handle that initial null. So I don't know if anybody has seen any better way or alternatives to that.
John, I assume you'd be able to use a null coalescing operator in that.
Yes, that's it. That's okay. It, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So yes, so results is now instantiated, but data is still null. There you go. And yes, you would. Yeah, so that would work. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks for that, Mark. Yeah, Chris has that blog post as well, which you referred to, John, with integrating Tailwind as well. It's definitely worth a read. I'll pop that into the chat for us. But what's quite interesting about Chris's article is he kind of starts off with a Bootstrap comparison, you know, right from the basics of a button, which is the first thing you tend to think of, you know, primary styling, and then kind of builds up from there. So that's quite an interesting read, definitely worth taking a look at. What was lovely was your iterative approach, John, and I think we can all kind of learn something from that, regardless of the problem, is to start with something that, you know, makes sense, that hard-coded data model that started to form a card, and I think we all really appreciate how you've you know, kind of gone through that process step by step.
It's really interesting, because I think I'm always conscious that it might be different for different people. So I think this might partly be how much of a visual thinker you are as well, in the sense that I always like to start with the design, but I know that's not for everyone. But for me personally, and I think, you know, people who do think visually, it's just that, look, here's the kind of mock-up or the design. How do I break that down? But then also using the hard-coded data and stuff is just a real quick way to iterate and to get something up on the screen and to start to feel. I tend to prefer development when it's full stack, because I can press a button and see something happen. Whereas when I got stuck in a back-end team doing like finance calculations, I was just pulling my hair out because it wasn't interesting to me. And obviously some people like it was really interesting too, but also I couldn't just click a button and see it work. So yeah, that's where the fun starts for me, I think.
Yeah, excellent. It cements things on the journey, doesn't it? You can kind of see where you're at rather than getting too lost in. So it's time now, I believe, to do our draw. Can I hand over to you, George?
Yeah, let's jump in. Super exciting stuff. Let me just get up my wheel of... Right. So here is the wheel. I can feel the suspense in the room. Everyone is shaking with excitement. Let's do it. So we'll spin, and whoever lands on will receive our prize, which is the Amazon gift card. Let's have a look. That is crazily close. Massive congratulations. There you go, Mark. That's all sorted. I'll message you privately and we'll get some details, get those sent across to you. But congratulations.
Thank you very much.
No worries at all.
It was close between me and John there.
That was nail-biting stuff at the end there.
I was going to shout fix if I got it. But...
I assumed that's how they were paying you, John.
I know, what do I do now?
Awesome.
I always thought that George was just nudging that on just past yours there.
That's it. He's got a secret
on the
lever.
wheel.
Lovely. Thanks, George.
No worries at all.
Superb. So I guess while we've still got John and obviously Chris in the chat room, are there any more questions or comments that you'd like to add before we let them have a rest?
Carl, I think you mentioned about Chris has already done a comparison between this and Bootstrap. If you can drop that link, because that would be my question: is why choose Tailwind over Bootstrap?
Yeah, I mean, Chris, would you like to elaborate just a little on that article? Sorry to drop you in it, but just give a bit of context on that, and I'll just drop the link in the chat.
Yeah, so just to be fair, it's not a complete comparison on Bootstrap to Tailwind. It's more of sort of starting off with an example that I thought most people would understand. Most people have used Bootstrap as a framework, so it's okay. Well, here's the BTN primary button, and here's what it looks like, and here's the classes you need to replicate that in Tailwind. So it's just a starting point, a kickoff. What I did make the point of is Tailwind is good if you don't want your site to look like every other site that's built with Bootstrap, because I don't know about anybody else, but I really am getting sick to death of Bootstrap. Not because it's a bad framework, it's just everything looks the same. And we've ended up with this wave of websites for like the last few years that all look exactly the same. They're either material or they're Bootstrap. And that's what everything is nowadays. What I like about Tailwind is, as John's demonstrated really, really well, is that you can create something that looks good, but also doesn't look like everything else. So that's really where I was trying to get at with the article, is that actually you don't have to be a designer. You don't have to rely on pre-built components that you do with Bootstrap. You can actually build something out that's relatively good, just using these utility classes. What is quite good from Bootstrap as well, they also have Tailwind UI, which is their equivalent of Bootstrap, which is pre-built components, but they still use the utility classes. So you can use those as well, but they are paid for, admittedly. But they're sort of done by a really good UI designer, Steve Schroeder. He's amazing. And he has a course actually as well called Refactoring UI, which I'd recommend anybody who does front end development to watch and to buy, because it's just got fantastic principles. Because he used to be a developer, so he really knows how developers think. So he puts things in context that makes sense. I'm similar to John. I'm very visual, and I really like UI design much more than back end. Crunching numbers does not float my boat one iota, but making a nice looking UI really does. So Tailwind for me works really well from that. I can get creative as well, which again is what I was trying to get across in the article. What John has as well. So.
I think for me it's it's like any abstraction can either get in the way or help. And I find increasingly, for me anyway, Bootstrap kind of gets in the way. Like I'm searching how to do stuff using Bootstrap, like, the cards, what CSS classes do I need to make a Bootstrap card? Whereas with Tailwind, I found it is much more of an iterative, like, oh, I'll try this, and oh, that works, and now I'll add a border, oh, that's good. And it's, you're not having to go and like debug the abstraction almost. You're just using it. It's like a tool that you're just using, and it shortens that gap between what you're trying to build and what you end up with on the screen, for me.
I think the other thing that's a great thing with Tailwind, which I pointed out in the blog post as well, is that it lends itself so well to Blazor and a component model. Because like John was pointing out in his talk, I've spoken to several developers who's knee-jerked exactly how John described. They've seen that wall of classes and gone, oh, that's horrible, I can't stand that. But actually, if you start thinking in terms of components, which obviously you should be when you're building Blazor apps, it actually makes a lot of sense. So instead of writing over and over again a paragraph tag, for example, with a load of custom styles to it, encapsulate that in a component, then use that component over and over again so that those styles are in one place. And now when you want to change what all your paragraphs looks like, you just changed your paragraph component, and now instantly all of your site is updated with whatever those new styles are. Paragraph's probably a really bad example to use for that. There's probably far more useful tags that I could think of. Buttons, that would be a great one. Don't use button and style it manually every time. Create a primary button component and style that, and then use that everywhere. And then, like I say, you can change that once and use it everywhere else. So that, again, I think I made that point in the article as well. So it lends itself well from that perspective too.
Lovely, yeah. Paul Francis dropped in that Tailwind UI link in there. As Chris said, it is paid, but it looks really complete. A couple of other comments in there about thoughts about Blazor Server versus Blazor WebAssembly, a common one that comes out in every discussion that we seem to have. But here, C. Augusto is basically asking, really, are there any kind of criteria to choose between the two? What are the kind of use cases? Throw that to the floor between yourself and John and Chris.
John, I'll let you have that one, mate.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I had a really specific case where Blazor WebAssembly wasn't a perfect fit, which was actually to do with like a landing page. So if this was a page that was just more or less like information, text, images and stuff. And it was interesting because I had a Blazor WebAssembly app, and this was just one page in it, and it made me realize that actually for that kind of content, it's the initial download of Blazor WebAssembly can become a problem, because essentially the rest of that app was dynamic, and therefore it made sense that you might expect that initial download to happen first, but it didn't make sense for these particular parts of that site. Whereas with Blazor Server, that problem goes away because you hit the server and you get the result back a lot quicker, and there's no initial download. But then you have the scaling the question over Blazor Server about latency and concurrency. So I don't know that it's clear cut actually, because as with every time someone says, oh, you might have a scaling problem, that's always actually subjective. Like for a lot of us, we won't, because we're not hitting those limits. So yeah, I'm not sure it's clear cut, but I think if you want something that's much more akin to most modern JavaScript frameworks, that is Blazor WebAssembly in terms of how you interact with APIs and that kind of thing. But then I think, and from what people have said to me, that Server offers a really nice upgrade path for existing, especially line of business apps that you might have, because it allows you to use components, but it's not taking a leap to suddenly running everything in the browser. So I'm not sure there's a correct answer to this, but as Chris will probably tell you as well, what I do like is that the component model is the same between them. So I think actually when you get to it, like I'm going to make up a random percentage, but probably 90% of what you do is in the component model, and so would work perfectly well whichever way you go with the hosting. So it becomes almost a lesser concern because you're not throwing all your eggs into one basket, and it doesn't stop you from using the other option if you needed to. So yeah, Chris, have you got any specific how to decide?
It is just horses for courses, like Jon's quite rightly pointed out. The biggest Achilles heel of Blazor WebAssembly, and frankly any SPA framework, is its download size. I mean, Angular apps go into the multi-megs quite easily. It's just that they hide them a bit better by chopping up the code a bit. But most Angular apps of any size will, I mean, ones I've worked on have easily hit 20 meg. You just don't realize it because you download it in sort of 21 meg chunks. It's and yeah, not everything should be written in Blazor. Like Jon said perfectly, that a landing page should not be written in Blazor, but it shouldn't be written it should be written in Angular, or maybe you could use Vue or something, or React. That's really a lightweight library, but not a framework and stuff like that. Scaling as well, like again, that Jon touched on. People say about Blazor Server, oh, it's no good, it doesn't scale. Well, it's not true. I do a talk where I talk about the scalability of Blazor Server and sort of quote some performance stats from the Blazor team, and like on a very, very low spec Azure instance, it will support 5,000 concurrent active users, not just connected users actually clicking around. I've never had to work on an app that's needed to support 5,000 currently active users in my whole career. And even if you need more than that, you only need to bump it up to the next level, and it'll do 20,000. And I've definitely never worked on an app that needs 20,000 active users at once. So I don't think scalability of Blazor Server is really an issue. What is an issue is latency, because of that round trip it needs to make to the server over the SignalR connection. But again, if you're running in the cloud, again, making something globally available in the cloud is not a difficult task nowadays, and it's not overly expensive either. So if you have a globally available app, the money it costs you to position it globally isn't going to be something you're going to care about either. So I personally don't think Blazor Server has a scaling problem. What's interesting about Blazor Server is it might actually be the sweet spot for sort of forward web development, is because there's a lot of talk now about whether SPAs are a good idea, because loading everything onto the client isn't ideal really in some scenarios, and security is next to impossible. With that everything running on the client, there isn't a good way of securing SPA apps. At the moment, the current recommendation is like code flow with Pixie, and like most things don't even support that yet. Blazor doesn't, for example. It will do in .NET 5, but it doesn't at the moment. So actually people are sort of saying as well, like, you look at something like a really popular site like Dev2, for example, right? Hugely popular site, lightning fast, really, really quick. Why? Because they pre-render everything, and they do everything on the server and download HTML. Stack Overflow, one of the most used websites in the world. Lightning fast, milliseconds to render pages and get them over to you. Server-side rendered. You won't find a single high-performance site that's a SPA. It's just not possible. So interestingly, Blazor Server actually might be one of the better models going forward for high-performance apps, because it's server-side rendered, and it is very, very efficient. The Blazor Pack protocol that the team built that works over SignalR is ridiculously efficient. So don't know, it might be, I've always been a very big fan of Blazor WebAssembly, but don't know, based on where the industry is looking at the moment, don't know, maybe Blazor Server will actually end up being the superstar at the end of all of this. I don't know. It's an interesting one. I'm still very much hanging on to WebAssembly at the moment, but
I think we're just destined to go like fat client, thin client, fat client, thin client,
back and forth, back and forth,
ad infinitum.
Great explanations, and obviously we've got pre-rendering as well with WebAssembly, haven't we? For the first kind of landing page. Another question around the Tailwind story. How would you theme with Tailwind and Blazor? That's from Andrew.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. I was thinking when Chris was talking about the way it fits really well with components. That's actually, I think, why it works well, because if you think about it, if you didn't have components, you would be repeating yourself a lot more. But it is possible, saying that, to define your own styles still and use them. So for example, I think I mentioned you could do like text primary, and that would give you the color that you've defined, and it would therefore be possible, I think, to essentially have different text primaries. But it's not something I've actually tried, so I'd have to think through how you would do that. But I'd imagine there would be, a mechanism to do that.
Yeah, super. Another one regarding hot reloading, or as we've described it here, about live reloading. The typical scenario we've got with ASP.NET Core, you make a change and everything updates. Have we got any knowledge of any projects or anything that will actually do that, or is in the wings in terms of what's coming?
I know they're working on, and I forget what it's called, but there is something they released around this, wasn't there, Chris? And they said they are looking at doing it for Blazor as well. I think it's like early stages, but it's definitely a problem because that feedback loop is jarring when you're used to just JavaScript, where you do just change it and it instantly refreshes. So, but I'm pretty sure they know that.
Yeah, it's probably the most. This and lazy loading for some reason is the highest probably requested features at the moment. I get why this. I don't get why lazy loading, but I do get why this. The feedback loop's crap. It really is terrible. It's horrible. It really is bad. And it's probably the weakest point of Blazor, I'd say, at the moment. The reason it's difficult is because there's no set standard in the whole of .NET for doing like hot reload. So I think what you're probably referring to, John, is possibly the Xamarin hot reload stuff that was previewed recently. What they're trying to do at the moment is Microsoft are actually trying to build a single hot reload platform that will work for the whole of .NET, any application type. Because there's different ways they did hot reloading in the past between different frameworks. And basically it meant that individual teams were maintaining one or possibly more ways of doing it. And it's not really a scalable thing. At least that's my understanding of where the problem was. So they wanted to reset and kind of create a uniform way of doing it. I think that's kind of how I've understood it. But I think this will be in .NET 5 because it is just such a big thing that they're missing. But I mean, like with WebAssembly, for example, you can see where the problem is because you're talking about spinning up a server from Visual Studio, for example, that needs to run WebAssembly code with a debugger and understand changes going on in Razor that's made up of 3 different languages with 3 different compilers, and then transfer those changes live over the wire to a browser, apply them without causing any refreshes, and the whole time you have to keep the state. I've just got a headache even thinking about how you would even do a quarter of that, let alone do the whole thing and do it all in a fraction of a second. So it's just not an easy thing to do. The whole Razor tooling is currently being rewritten as well, because that's just not quite sort of working as well as they want it to. So there's lots of good stuff coming, but you know, like I said as well, I tend to sort of reiterate a lot of the times is, you know, people forget, I think, because how well Blazor is doing for how young it is, just how young it is. I mean, this is a framework that only came out of preview a few months ago. And it gets compared to the likes of React and Angular really often. I have people, you know, I'm sure John's had this as well. Like, you get people all the time, well, how does it compare to React? I don't know. React's been around for about 6 years now and is really well baked. And this came out 3 months ago. So you can't compare it. It's apples and oranges at the moment. I think the fact that even people try to shows how far Blazor is along its journey already, which is a good thing. But it you know, we just have to remind ourselves every now and then that it's very, very, very new, and things are just taking their time to develop.
Exactly. If you think it's I mean, WebAssembly is a V1. It's really, the thing that struck me actually is how mature its component model is for something that's brand new, actually.
But like you said, John, it's based very heavily on React.
Yeah.
Like you say, it's taken a huge sort of influence from that, and React's model is very good in that regard. So,
yeah.
You know, like I say, building on the soul of the giants, I think, really.
That's it.
We have a hand raised from Ian Watson. You've got a question, Ian?
Yes, thanks, Carl. I actually thought of this question and wrote it down before I saw your email today, John, about how to choose what sort of MVC or Razor Pages or Blazor and what to use. So with so many advantages, it seems hard to me that you don't always use Blazor. I've seen it said, though, that with some shopping carts, it's not appropriate. And apart from maybe some very large enterprise systems, are there any instances where Blazor isn't worth considering? Or is it just the silver bullet? Does it do everything for everybody?
I'm always
do everything in the future when it's really mature, you know. It's hard not to always think, oh, I'll use Blazor, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always cautious about the silver bullet thing. But
I'm not. It's a silver bullet. It'll solve everything.
I think so. For me, what that would, so actually, I mean, anecdotally, I've always tended to jump on new stuff. That's just like, that's always been my thing. So going way back to Angular, when I liked it, I must admit I'm not a fan of newer Angular, but you know, Angular JS as they now call it, and MVC when that came out, you know, all the way through, I've always tended to leap into things. But then more recently, the only thing I would kind of temper that with, I think, and this is probably just, you know, maturity and wisdom that comes with being slightly closer to my 40th birthday than I was care to admit, that the development team has to go with it. So in a few jobs now, I've kind of had that more clear realization that there is a cost to using any technology, whether it's the learning curve, whether it's existing knowledge or existing systems or whatever it might be. So I'm tempted to say I think Blazor is good for everything because I like the component model. The hosting models means you can use it. It kind of makes it much more applicable to different use cases because you can host it differently. The only caveat I can think of is if you've got a big investment in existing tech like MVC and don't forget there's like, you know, because I hear from them occasionally, and I myself, even in the last year, there are still some of us having to dip our toes into web forms from time to time. So there's always that factor, you know, the pragmatic side of introducing a new technology with a team and how easily can they pick it up and migrate what they have to it. But I actually think the path from web forms to Blazor may be more straightforward than the path ever was from web forms to MVC, because that was a strange jump, actually, suddenly breaking stuff down into models and views and controllers, which actually feels a bit arbitrary. And increasingly you look at that and think that's a weird structure, actually, to separate things that way. So I think the component approach is easier because web forms kind of went that road with server controls and all that kind of thing. So yeah, I'm struggling to give you really good reasons not to use it, put it that way.
Okay. Thank you. Carl, I've got a second question. Can I hit it? Go with it now?
Go on, Ian. Why not?
Yeah, sure. It's about unit testing. Does Blazor and the notion of components actually make it easier, or is it more difficult to do unit testing in Blazor. I'm aware that Steve Sanderson's done a blog talking about testing, but I just wondered, John, if you had knowledge and views on it.
So my views would be that, well, there's evidence from, again, React community and others that testing components as an approach has merit, not least because if you kind of think if you're building individual components that are essentially, I also think of them as kind of self-contained APIs in a way. I think sometimes that goes wrong. So sometimes people, because they're building like 4 components, it's possible to arbitrarily split a bigger thing up into 4 components, but then build those components in such a way that they're all kind of coupled together anyway, which can be problematic because suddenly changing your app is hard when it isn't supposed to be. But I think if you design your components well, so they're essentially, you know, and I think of them as an API, so they have inputs and outputs. So an input is parameters, an output may be an event callback or something. In theory, and in practice in other languages, testing that component does work just for the logic of that component and maybe testing how it renders and stuff. But then also, obviously, you've got the usual thing that you want to test how it interacts with other components as well, just to give you some confidence. I've got to admit, I've not spent much time. I know there are developments, aren't there? Like, is it Blazor Unit or something?
Unit.
Yeah. So there's stuff coming. Like I say, for something like that, you can look at other frameworks and say, well, component testing has merit. But it's kind of part of a bigger piece, I think, of overall testing. That you would still want to do to some extent, just even if it's just smoke testing that the app loads. You know, it's funny how even something that simple can save you more than you might imagine sometimes.
Thank you.
Chris, did you have any thoughts on the unit testing story or testing in general?
No, I kind of echo what John says, really. I think unit testing components that are built well is easier because they are self-contained and they are black box testable. So you should be able to pass in parameters to them and expect a certain result based on those parameters, regardless of the internal implementation. So that makes tests less brittle. What's interesting about the B-unit testing framework from Eagle is the fact that he kind of mixes this idea of unit and integration testing into kind of one thing, which is quite cool. So you've got this kind of hybrid model that has kind of the benefits of both with pretty much none of the negatives. Because I don't know if anyone's ever tried to use something like Selenium. I had the joy of building a testing framework with that before, and it's horrific because it's just brittle as anything. One timing goes off and your test fails and you run it again, then it passes, which is useless. But because Blazor components can be rendered with a renderer, Eagle's written a test renderer that will render it out, so you never have to worry about timing issues and stuff like that. So he will make sure that, you know, if you're going to click a button, the button's properly rendered before you try and click it and all this kind of stuff. So it works really well. I think it's probably the recommended framework. I don't think the Blazor team are going to build a unit test framework themselves anymore. They're pushing Eagles. So definitely check out B-Unit.
So there won't be an MS unit for Blazor.
No, they're too busy building Hot Reload.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks for that. That's really interesting. We've put the link also to John's demo, obviously in the chat as well. So it's definitely worth taking a look at there, along with the B unit link as well. Andrew had a comment about mixing Razor and Blazor markup. Obviously, there's a lot of investment gone into learning Razor syntax for Razor pages and also MVC pages. Any thoughts on that, John?
Yeah. So you, so I guess there's the interesting thing as well that when we're building Blazor, the good news is I think that you're still writing Razor. So all that Razor knowledge, a chunk of it comes across, albeit extended for Blazor. But then the other thing is you can embed, now I've not done this in prod, but I wrote a blog post about it. It is possible to add a Blazor component, to render a component inside a Razor page. So there is an option there. It's doable. I mean, how practical that is, again, I've just not done it in prod, so I couldn't tell you, but it's feasible. When I saw that, I thought it could be useful if you do have an existing app and you just want to begin to add components to it. I can dig out the post actually if it's useful. Just share that in the chat. But yeah, so it's feasible. But I think, yeah, a lot of the Razor knowledge will transfer across, but as always, it's useful to have an upgrade path, isn't it? And not just have to replace the whole thing.
Very good. Yeah, thank you for that. One interesting question in the chat, quite a specific one, from Zhdanko regarding smart card reading in a Blazor WASM PWA. Sounds very detailed, but any thoughts on that question?
No, but I guess it's an interesting one generally, how you would do that from the client, so from a browser, because don't forget Blazor is essentially still running in the browser in a sandbox, so I don't know, it's not something I know much about, to be honest, but I guess the question would be back on that is, how does that work, if it works at all in the browser generally? Because if it works in the browser today, then there would be a way of doing it in Blazor, I'm sure, even if it ended up going to JavaScript to do it, which you can do, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer, isn't it? If there's anything JavaScript based, we can kind of fall back on the interop story,
yeah,
and still make it work in Blazor. But would that be a good design choice? Is it currently possible? I think that's a really good answer. Thank you, Jon. So Alex has dropped in a link to a .NET Rocks show around BUnit, which could be of interest to others in terms of Eagle actually talking on the show by the looks of it. So yeah, definitely worth a look. Okay, Jon's dropped in that nice link there for using Blazor in an existing MVC .NET Core typical application, combining the two. But I think we're coming to a close. I think we'd like to really thank Jon for two great presentations, and also for sharing your insights and your thoughts. Also thanks to Chris as well, and we're looking forward to having you next month as well. And it'd be lovely to have you on board as well, Jon, if you can make that event.
Well, I need to heckle.
You need to help me answer questions, mate. That's
I've got all the daylight's gone, so I now look like I'm got some kind of fake orange tan going on. It's amazing.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I think we've had a really good evening, some fantastic content, and definitely some brilliant things to think about. So we'll look forward to hopefully having you again soon, Jon, on another really interesting topic. And really like to say thank you to you for this evening.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. And I didn't have to travel, which is a bonus.
Well, if you're enjoying the content in our .NET Foundation user group, then please subscribe to the channel. Also hit the bell icon to get notifications of when we upload new content. If you have a technical topic that others could benefit from, whether it be .NET, Azure, or focus on Blazor, then reach out for a future presentation. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's presentation as much as we did, and we look forward to seeing you next time.